Good morning, and welcome to our adult forum, second in the series that focuses on the 75 years of Lutheran Church of the Resurrection. And this time we're going to focus on the transition from the Missouri Synod to the ELCA. And we have a panel group that looks like old white male, as Pastor Hausman said, extinguished panelists. Yes. Pastor Sarah will be with us shortly. We got Lou here. Can you see Lou? Oh, now you see Rebecca. But Lou is there too. And Lou is going to be here, but she's at Johanna Shores that are having a lockdown because of the norovirus. She's doing fine, Donna doing fine, but she couldn't be here. So and you know our plight with our lack of a projector, which has to be corrected. But in the meantime, we're trying to set up some speakers so we can hear Lou and her contributions as a long-term member. And so Paul Westermeyer was willing to join us up front to offer this. I just asked him a couple seconds ago. Yes. And because of his tenure in multiple Lutheran bodies and actually beyond the Lutheran Church, growing up some kind of covenant.
19th century dissertation, you mean?
Well, no, just you didn't grow up in Lutheran.
No, I grew up in a Reformed congregation. Sally grew up in Evangelical Synod of North America, which is Lutheran, and so I can say something about that, but also something about Missouri and my contacts with.
I just might add a little bit to that. I grew up in a Methodist church, so I'm kind of an outcast along with Paul here, but we're going to make it work.
I love the rich variety that we bring, and that is our reality. I mean, as we look at Lutheran Church of Resurrection today, yes, we're talking about the prior Lutheran bodies, but the reality is we bring in so many different traditions. I was a pastor in Lincoln, Nebraska, in 1 year, and there's a women's circle group who were dissing me and my colleague because we were messing with the Holy Communion service. Well, as you might remember, the old Green hymnal, LBW, was suggesting we should have communion weekly, not quarterly or once a month or something. And the congregation I served, it was difficult to do communion more frequently because of the way we did the distribution. It just took forever in a day. And we had 3 services on a Sunday morning, back to back to back. So my colleague, the senior pastor, and I were experimenting with some different things, and we were using bread instead of poker chips, and we were using a common cup instead of shot glasses, and we were getting dissed for all of that. So I went to the women's circle. I said, can I come to your circle? I hear you're unhappy with Pastor Don and me. And they said, oh, we'd love for you to come. So I just said, I hear you're unhappy with what we're doing with Holy Communion these days. Oh, yes. And I didn't get another word in. They started telling me everything I was doing wrong and why I wasn't doing the traditional way. I said, I've only been here a year. Help me understand the tradition in this congregation. They said every possible, imaginable way of distributing communion, including up and down the pews. There is a holy silence. I'd like to consider it a repentant silence. As these people in this Bible study realized they didn't agree with each other because their own backgrounds were so varied. So I think that's a perfect introduction. Now, people like Pastor Hausman and me, we're very narrow, old school. We're Lutherans from the day we were born. For me, because whatever the congregation was that was being built on the corner of the street, that's what we were going to go to. So that's how I became a good Lutheran. So in the meantime, let's begin. So we have Pastor Hausman, we have Paul Westermeyer, we have Wayne Griesel, and we have Luzabel, and we have Pastor Sarah. Pastor Sarah and I will exchange emceeing this through the hour. And so with that, let's begin with prayer. Dear gracious God, we thank you for your word that gives us life, for your sacraments that gives us your visible word to embody your presence in our midst, and we as your body as a gift to the world. We thank you for the shoulders on whom we have stood through this congregation over 75 years and many, many other congregations that have shaped who we are as individuals, as households, as communities of faith, as this congregation, as synods and larger church bodies. Come, Holy Spirit, enliven our conversations today that we may be strengthened and encouraged in our witness to you for a world that needs grace and mercy and peace. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so as Pastor Sarah is continuing the tech work, that's why we called her here. So just a reminder, a month ago we had our first forum that just talked about the early days. Just enjoy that time, and that was with John Pollock, Dennis Stope, Marilyn, and Bob King. And today you have our panelists, including Lou, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and Bob has a microphone there, to get us started with just the pre-resurrection history of being a Missouri Synod congregation. So Bob, you're going to talk to us a bit about leaving Europe, the CWF Walther, the early days in the United States, and how that developed into a Missouri Synod piety and theology. And take your time, Bob. You have 5 minutes.
Well, unlike this disparate background of all these fellows here, I'm Eckdeutsch, all the way back. I grew up at St. Matthias Evangelische Lutherische Kirche, Deutsche, in New Britain, Connecticut. So Missouri Synod has been a part of my life from the very beginning. And I guess, I don't know what the word synod even means to some of these young people. Do you know the roots of the word synod? Why do we talk about synods? Syn, together, hodos, odometer, way, syn, hodos, is walking the way together. So that's what a synod is. People who come together around a common confession. So our progenitor...
Wave your other hand and hold that one close to your mouth.
I'm not good at this. I also would rather be standing behind a lectern. But all right, so anyway, our progenitor is C.F.W. Walther. Karl Ferdinand Wilhelm Walther, C.F.W. Walther. And his dates are 1811 to 1887. He was born in Saxony in Germany, a part of a long line of Lutheran pastors. That was common in those days, a lot of usually pastors. It stayed in the family, the kind of craft that you did, you kept in the family. So he was from a long line of Lutheran pastors. He got his theological training in Leipzig. Some of you Bach fans know Leipzig. But he fled Germany because he felt that the church was being overtaken by rationalism, okay? That there was a developing sense that the church didn't have all the answers, that everything in the Bible wasn't just as it was stated and so forth. And so he came from Germany to America. Now this is something to think about because he came running away from something, see? And to some extent, the history of Missouri is kind of a running away from things, not an embracing and wrestling with things. But anyway, he came to America, he brought this confessionalism with him, and it had the bad side to it, that it could be very dogmatic, but it had a good side to it, that it was confessional. And along with the confession, he brought the Lutheran chorales and the liturgy and so forth. So that's a part of the German Lutheran Church going way back, to be a liturgical church, following the church year, understanding the scripture and all. So he was the first president of the Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the Missouri, Ohio, and other states. And I don't even know what the other states were. Okay, but that was the place that it began with Walter, and he introduced materials for the layperson. The magazine was called Der Lutheraner. Anybody know Der Lutheraner? How about the Lutheran Witness? Did anybody ever know the Lutheran Witness? Okay, so the Lutheran Witness was the English form of Der Lutheraner. And he also established a magazine for professionals, for theologians. It was called Lehre und Wehre. And Lehre is to teach, and Wehre is to get it right. So all of these things are reflected in his history. All of these other synods, as far as I know, are gone except for the Wisconsin Synod. I mean, there were synods in, other parts of the country. There were Norwegian synods and Swedish synods and so forth. But the only one that I think you would hear of today is Wisconsin Synod. And what do you think of when you think of Wisconsin Synod? People think it's even more conservative than Missouri Synod, right? I have no idea if that's true anymore, but that's what they said. That's what's been the story. So anyway, Walter died in 1887, but he left behind this German-speaking church, and this German-speaking church saw you English-speaking people as a mission field. Okay, so that's very serious. You were the mission field. That the church, the true church, the Deutsche Church, was sent out to evangelize you, the English-speaking people. And the one connection here is that this was an English district church, and what was the English district doing in the Missouri Synod? The Missouri Synod districts were geographical or regional. So there would be a northern Minnesota district, and there'd be a southern Minnesota district. But there were these people, these pastors who say, well, we want to do English language missionary work, and we want to do it in communion with the developing sense of science and the like. So what the fathers, there were no mothers. I'm sorry. So what the fathers said to these pastors who wanted to do this English language work, well, you form your own synod. We don't want you in northern Minnesota synod. You go form your own synod. So they did, and they called this the English Synod. Yep. It was called the English Synod, and it tended to go to urban areas because that's where the action was. So the English district was a progressive district in mainly urban areas, like New York, Chicago, Twin Cities, or whatever. A lot of pastors of my generation wanted to get a call into the English district because they felt that was where the action was. This church, being in the Twin Cities, was an English district congregation too. And when I came here, I don't know, when did I come here? It doesn't matter. When I came here, it had a German background. We had the Schubrings and the Mulesteds and so forth, but it didn't have a strong German character. I would go to different lay people to do caring visits and so forth, that I asked them whether they wanted to pray the Vater Unser. No, they would just soon pray Our Father and so forth. So I never got a sense that this was had a good, strong German background, except for Heineke, because that's good. That's good German.
Who determined that this church would be English district? The pastor that was called, or the Missouri Synod?
I think Langhans was the first pastor, but I don't know how they decided to be.
Well, my understanding is that the congregation was formed as a what do we call mission church from Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, which was English district, and so ergo.
So then we have to ask, how did Redeemer become? Yeah, I served as an interim pastor for a year at Lutheran Church Redeemer in St. Paul, and they wanted me to know quite readily that, we are the mother church for your congregation, Resurrection. And very proud of that extension. That was part of that missional piece.
Mount Olive was also a mission church of Redeemer. So this church and Mount Olive both were formed from Redeemer, as far as I can tell. And can I piggyback on what
I'm
you
done.
said? Oh, you're done. To drive this question back to Germany again, Bob said the Wisconsin Synod was even more conservative. Well, I suppose yes and no, that's true. Grabau was the person in the Wisconsin Synod. The Wisconsin Synod just produced another hymnal called Christian Worship, which is exactly the same as the previous name of their last hymnal. And it's really not a bad hymnal. I mean, it's an evangelical Lutheran hymnal. But here is what I think really needs to be. I have not run this down carefully, but I think this is true. Frederick William III in Prussia, I think his dates are 1770 to 1840 or something like that. He tried to jam together the Reformed and the Lutheran confessions. And confessional folks objected. And apparently the Lutheran ones got thrown in jail. And here you can see, I think, what happens when you make that kind of a response. Then that group can become legalistic itself. What's very interesting about this is that Missouri Synod, my doctoral advisor, Martin Marty, told me about this, who also comes from Missouri Synod. He told me on German Lutheran churches in the United States, which were Missouri, and I'll tell you about the other one in a minute, it said evangelisch. The other one also said evangelisch. That's the Evangelical Synod of North America. That's the synod from which my wife Sally comes from. It's also the Synod of Elmhurst College that Sally and I both went to, which is, the first house there was called Melanchthon House. That's Luther's right-hand man. And the Niebuhrs, very important theologians, come from that school. It's a Lutheran school, but the Lutherans and the Evangelical Synod were at war. In this country, I think, stimulated still what happened in Germany. So, as in Sally's hometown, the Missouri Synod pastor would not stand on the podium in town with any other pastor, including the Evangelical Synod of North America, which is a Lutheran body. So you get these considerable conflicts, and it gets more and more legalistic. I don't know, shall I add also that I don't know, is somebody going to say something about John teaching?
I just want to jump in here too. So part of Missouri Synod was not only legalistic and literalistic in terms of interpretation of the Bible, they also wanted to protect what they thought was reine Lehre, pure teaching. And if you want to protect pure teaching, you don't want to get on the forum with any other pastor from any other denomination. So that's important part, right?
That's exactly true, but you want to know who most protected doctrine? Musicians, ladies and gentlemen. The musicians are the ones who sing the faith. And what is in the faith? The guts of the evangelical essence of the gospel. And as Eric Routley said, musicians, this is related to maybe what you said before, musicians are the most promiscuous group in the church because we actually talk to one another who are Methodists and different kinds of Lutherans and Episcopalians and Roman Catholics, and that big, huge, repertoire of the church's music transcends and undercuts all of our warfare. At some point, I want to say something about teaching, but go ahead.
Well, I want to jump in because Lou's background with the English Synod is different, and I would love, Lou, if you'd be up for sharing with us how your background, you all found your way into the English Synod and thus to this congregation.
I had a hard time hearing what other people have said, so what I say may not connect.
No worries.
Were you asking me to give my history, basically?
Yes, please.
Okay. I grew up in a small Finnish synod called the National Evangelical Lutheran Church. We had about 10,000 members scattered throughout the United States wherever there was a Finnish enclave. And all our pastors were trained at the Springfield Seminary of the Missouri Synod under kind of a special dispensation because they didn't go through the educational system of Missouri Synod. They went directly from even high school to the seminary. But because of its Finnish background, we always had things like women's suffrage in the church and so on, and we were a very liturgical church and so on, and because of the courtship that had gone on between Missouri Synod and NELC, they finally started talking merger. And the merger happened, I think, in 1961. But part of the negotiation was that we could no longer have women's suffrage. Women could not participate in the voters' meetings of a Missouri Synod congregation. And apparently our team said, well, in that case, nothing doing, we don't want to take a step backwards. And apparently it resulted in a resolution then that allowed congregations to take a vote whether or not to include women in the voters' meetings. So I was a member of a Missouri Synod church in Minneapolis and later Louisville before we bought our home in Roseville. And then when we were looking for a church, we were looking for Missouri Synod churches. Of course, but we knew people who were members of Resurrection, and so it was very easy to come here to worship, and it didn't take long for us to become members. Because, for one thing, women could participate in the voters' meetings.
Well, thank you, Lou. On behalf of everybody here, we're so glad that there was wisdom to be more inclusive at that time. I'd like us to move forward with the next major topic. We've already introduced something about the English district. And the next major piece was the Concordia St. Louis Seminary split and the development of Seminex. And we have pastors up front to experience some of that, but I'd also like to get it from the non-pastor perspective, Lou and Wayne. What you remember about those years? What was it like to be part of Resurrection during this time of wondering where we were going because the seminary was fractured? So, Lou, why don't you begin, and then Wayne will pick up on that.
Well, I guess I first became involved with the convention, the Missouri Synod Convention that happened in New Orleans. And when our delegation from the St. Paul Circuit was not seated, was not credentialed, and the people who were representing us wound up sitting in the balcony and just observing. And so on. So that, of course, that involved our congregation, and because one of the voters and members was a member of this congregation.
Lou, help us understand, why was it that you guys were excluded and put in the balcony? I'm not quite making the connection.
Well, the official reason was that we did not have enough congregations in the St. Paul Circuit to warrant having a representative convention.
Do you think that was true, or is that just a political ploy?
Well, it felt like a political ploy to us because we had 7 congregations that had been around for a long time, and then 3 basically mission starts that were part of the St. Paul Circuit.
Isn't it amazing how?
Which would have given us the 10 congregations we needed.
Just stunning. I'm sure that's the first time in church history
I would just like to back up a little bit.
I disregard what I suggest, just talk.
I'm going to tell you what I think. No, when this church was formed, in 1947, it was in the English district, which was, you might say, a progressive, conservative district within the English Synod was English district within the Missouri Synod. But this congregation was even a little more progressive because from day one, we allowed women to vote, which was really extraordinary in those days. But jumping forward to 1960s, 1970s, as Lou said, there was some controversy beginning with the teachings at seminary and who was supporting seminary in St. Louis and who was not. And this gets back to Paul's suggestion that following the, check my notes here, 73, the Synod resolution was passed essentially saying that all events described in the scripture actually occurred. Those are words out of the resolution at the convention. And prior to this time, the seminary professors, many of them were kind of deviating from that philosophy, and this became the cornerstone of the separation that Dr. Tejan Dr. Tejan and many of the students and professors walked out and formed what was called Seminary in Exile, or Seminex. And this was then kind of the beginning of transition for us. I don't know if you want to talk more about Seminex, Paul, or?
What I was going to do is say something about John Teachin. When I was at Union Seminary, I was in the Master of Sacred Music program. Union Seminary had a School of Sacred Music and a Master of Sacred Music program. And all of us who were the musicians in the program had to have fieldwork positions. So one of the professors suggested to me that I might like to go across the river to New Jersey, across the Brooklyn Bridge to New Jersey, and work in Calvary Lutheran Church with John Teachin. It was a Missouri Synod church. And I, since I was not from this august background here, wondered about that just because of the experience that I had growing up in Cincinnati, the same sort of thing. He said, no, it's a good place. When I went there, I discovered there was an English district synod as well. John Teachin was the pastor. He's one of the best pastors, scholars, lecturers, students one can imagine. He was a joy to work with. His sermons were always profoundly evangelical, and he was a wonderful presider, and the congregation was a small congregation. It's the worst choir I ever had. It was an absolutely terrible choir, but they were absolutely wonderful. And I learned something else there. I did my master's project there, and I knew I needed some help, so I brought ringers from the school. And they sat next to the choir members and helped them learn the piece that we were working on. And afterwards, guess what? The choir was wonderful. I really learned, I don't learn as much from David by listening maybe to what he says, but by sitting next to him and singing with him or working with him. Anyway, John Teachin then was involved with Seminex. I also studied at Concordia Seminary before I went, before the breakup. And then Teachin came there, wonderful place also. And I should also add that the godfather and godmother of that fellow back there named Chris, our son, were John and Ernestine Teachin.
Could I ask a question? And this gets to maybe a little bit more of a personal experience. I'm curious, what was it like personally and in the congregation here specifically, but other places where you were, what was it like to leave your home church? I mean, what was that like to leave the Missouri Synod and to find your way to a new place? What did that feel like?
Yeah, well, that's leading into what I was getting ready.
Woohoo!
Basically, to talk about events here, after the walkout formation of Seminex, and associated with that was a group of churches that says we're going to support Seminex, and they became, trying to remember the acronym here, the ELUM, Evangelical Lutherans in Mission, was a group of churches that said we were going to support Seminex. So here in our congregation, starting in about 1973, Pastor Fueling, who came just shortly before that, and our Director of Education, Larry Norton, started having Sunday morning adult forums to talk about events. I mean, we kind of hearing on the periphery things were going on, but didn't really know much about it until they started telling us, there are things happening in the church, and started talking about the issues and teaching us, what was going on. And two things I remember, well, one specifically, a big word is exegetical interpretations. So we had a couple of years of that educational period before we took a vote and says, first of all, we sent some letters to Elam saying we're supporting MNX, and to our district advisor that, we don't like what's going on within Missouri Synod.
Wayne, was that time for you exciting? As a community, was it scary?
Well, I guess because I guess my perception was, because it was happening kind of gradually, that it wasn't too severe because we're having all these classes. But then the culmination was a bus trip down to Chicago, and I can't remember exactly what the occasion was, whether it was an Elam thing or an ELCA thing, or an AELC. But there were 5 of the local English district churches members, and Lou and I and my wife Carolyn and people from Redeemer and Pilgrim and Gethsemane and I believe Cross were on this bus, and it was a good trip and supporting the Elam and the Seminex.
Wayne, just a personal, talk about Carolyn's family in Oklahoma and what happened to her father. I think that gives you a good sense of what was
it's
it
kind
like.
of a personal thing outside of this congregation, but to me and my wife at the time, her parents would come once or twice a year from Oklahoma and visit in this period of time, and we would talk about what was going on, because his church in Oklahoma, small farming community church, was having similar discussions. And he would ask us our opinion, and we explained what we were learning, and he says, I like that. So he went back to Oklahoma, and started talking about these things. And I think they even actually ended up calling a new graduate pastor who was kind of on the Seminex side, but he didn't last long. And then Carolyn's father and mother were excommunicated from their church because of their feelings. But luckily, they went to a new church, or an older church in Enid, 12 miles away, and found a pastor and a congregation that would accept them. So they weren't completely kicked out of the church, but just that one little congregation. But it, touched pretty close to home. Anyway, following the bus trip And the first step from Elam was to take all of those churches and form a new association, which was the Evangelical Lutheran Church. No, I'm back right. Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. I get the AELC mixed up with the ELC. But anyway, Harold Hecht was elected president. But prior to that, we had an event here in this church, an opportunity that probably no one else had, that our pastor Daniel Fueling was a classmate of Dr. Teachin in seminary, and we had members here who were cousins of Dr. J.A. Preuss. So we had the opportunity to invite each of them on separate Sundays to come and talk to us from the pulpit and answer specific questions that the congregation posed. And you know, that was helpful, but I think really our mind was made up before that.
Who was Preuss?
Oh, well, Dr. Preuss was the synodical president, Missouri Synod. And of course, that was the ultra-conservative.
You got to hear both sectors.
So we got to hear straight from the mouth.
Lou, I'm sorry you haven't been able to follow with the sound system, but we're asking more of the visceral, what was it like for you personally and your sense for resurrection to make the transition from Missouri Synod to Elam, AELC, then onto the ELC? We talked about that early 1970s period. What sense of excitement, fear, commitment, what was going on at Resurrection during this tumultuous time?
Well, I heard you use the word scary with somebody else, what I heard, and it certainly was scary in a sense, because we felt like we were, some of us at least, felt like we were adrift on an ice boat, basically, and the ABLC was a wonderful life for us to operate under at that time. And I really bless Pastor Phelan because he trusted us as a congregation to make up our own minds, because like he said, he was a product of the seminary that supposedly housed all these, quote, heretics. And
Lou,
we need to judge by the product. But I was grateful for the leadership from Rev. Raywalk, who was president of the congregation at the time. He had us through some rough times.
Lou, Wayne was wanting me to ask you, what was the impact of the women's group in the life of the congregation during that time? What was the role the women played?
Well, I was on the original transition team for the women of the ELCA when we were putting, starting to put the organization together. And so that I was very impressed by the government structure that we were able to set up, for instance. And many women led the way for moving the process along for doing the merger between the LCA and ALC and little AELC.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Paul,
Yeah.
Bob, Wayne, what do you want to follow?
yeah, I'm just gonna say, not being actual part of that, but I got the impression it was pretty traumatic going from the Missouri Synod structured church and then trying to set up a whole new system within the AELC and ELCA. So that, there was significant changes in their structure, but I wasn't really part of it.
There's a comfort of looking back at that history, but I think we can sense the kind of uncertainty and fear and trembling that can take place with that. Yes. Paul.
I should say that when I was teaching at Elmhurst College, I had a part-time job as a choir master and organist in one of the churches in Chicago. It was an AELC church. It happened to be one where Martin Marty himself was a member, just simply a member there. But Paul Landau, who was a classmate of Bob's, when we came here, Paul said, you should go visit that church. And I must say that that church and the one I served in Leonia, New Jersey, and the one, this one, who've been tested by fire, so to speak, but who've had to figure out the essence of the Christian witness and gospel, had a very similar character to them, and they're welcoming. This guy, when I first walked in here, right after the church, he actually talked to me. I mean, this is, and I should say also, I am not unserious about the importance of song. What characterized all of these places, in spite of all the conflicts, was the congregation sang. They participated and sang, and so did the choir to help them. But there is an interesting web, I think, going on here altogether.
I've got a couple of things I need to throw in before my mind slips and they'll disappear. First of all, regarding AELC, Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches in America, it was only a temporary thing. We all knew that was temporary. We were waiting for something more. So at the time, AELC didn't have a structure. No, they didn't want to start seminary, colleges, or whatever. It was temporary. But they did need to funnel pastors through. So Peter Marty, Dan Fueling was a classmate, not only of John Teacher, but of Martin Marty. Peter Marty was going to Lutheran School of to Yale Divinity, I think. Yale Divinity, and he came out of Yale Divinity with his degree, but he needed pastoral experience to get ordained. Okay, so Marty knew our church. Harold Heck was the president. Harold Heck calls me and says, would you take a vicar to give him the experience? So that's how we got Peter Marty here as a vicar. But it's amazing that Pastor Fueling was a classmate of both Martin Marty and John Teachin, and it's also amazing that they were able to put together this confrontation between Jake Preuss and Teachin here in this congregation to debate the issues, because no other congregations did that. Pastors would leave the synod. That was easy. They would say, I can't live with this congregation. They don't want to listen to me. They don't, and congregations don't like to move. You're right. No. But this church, of all the churches, I don't know of any other where they actually had both sides told and then made a vote. That was unusual.
That's not unrelated to the congregation song. I'm really serious about that. You realize what Bob just said here is that the congregation is an important part of this. The pastor presides and preaches, right? But the congregation is an equally important part of the service itself. And then the congregation is the one that's called to go out into the world, to serve the world, and to bring to the world what it has received here. So, I mean, I'm really, really serious about this. This is related to the mission of the church. It's related to the song of the church, all the people of the church, not only these guys.
Lou,
Lou.
yeah.
Let's hear from Lou.
Relating to the music, the hymn, The Church is One Foundation, almost became like a battle song to those of us who were riding a bus to Chicago and so on. And to this day, I still can't sing that hymn without getting weepy.
Powerful stuff. I think it's worth pausing just to appreciate the spirit of the congregation, the lay leadership of the congregation, the pastoral leadership of the congregation, to make this kind of a move possible. Some of us know what's taken place since 2009 with the ELCA and congregations leaving the ELCA, and so many horror stories about a pastor just kind of pulling the whole congregation out, or in reverse, getting rid of the pastor. But here there is clearly multiple dialogue opportunities and a real spirit of openness that, dare we say, is rare sometimes? Something to be appreciated. Yeah. Okay. Wayne.
I think as far as that part of the history, yes. You ready to go to the next step?
Certainly. I think we're at the time of just saying, what is the impact of the Missouri Synod to the AELC, and what it's left us with here 75 years
Yeah.
into
Well, I just wanted to say that, we went through that very traumatic period in the 70s to get to the AELC, so that when it came time in the 80s to finally merge with a larger body, it was very benign. It just happened. I mean, we took a vote and said, yes, we're going to do this. I think there may have been more, and we'll talk to you about this, more controversy in the other synods about merging than there was within the AELC.
Just so you can organize yourself around the thought, why do we have 3 churches, Lutheran churches, within 2 miles on Victoria? Okay, that's because before there was the ELCA, there was the ALC, and then there was the LCA, and then there was the AELC, or Missouri. Yeah, and so when the merger all took place, suddenly we have these congregations right down in a row.
Picking up on what Wayne was alluding to, so those of us not part of the Missouri Synod, we're still looking at how to unify the Lutheran mission and voice in the United States. In the 1800s, there were 150 different Lutheran bodies, 150. And now we were really, by the 1950s and 60s, about in the 60s, 3 major. Lutheran Church in America, largely Swedish background and German background, American Lutheran Church, Danish and German, Norwegian, and then Missouri Synod. And so there was this desire to bring us together. The debate was that helpful? One of the major voices that I was hearing, or arguments that I was hearing as an American Lutheran Church pastor, was, look at why duplicate and triplicate all our structures? Why not simplify it so that we can focus on the real issues of outreach to the world around us? ALC had like 28 different districts. I don't know how many the LCA had. So instead of duplicating, let's just bring this together. The American Lutheran Church national president, another Preuss, David Preuss, wasn't really in favor of that. And some felt like it was a sour grapes position because the ALC was the smallest and he would be ousted. But he kept saying, it's actually going to get in the way of our mission. And what did we end up with? 65 synods, 9 regions, and a corporate office in Chicago. So some of us wonder about the wisdom of how that developed. But so for those of us not in the Missouri Synod, I clearly understand the AELC longing for this group to join, and it ended up joining a new entire body. Let me add, as long as I have the microphone here, the great benefit of the Missouri Synod to the new church, the ELCA, was their preparation and deep theological training from elementary school on to high school. By the time some of these students finished high school, they already had their Hebrew and their Greek and their German, preparing them for seminary. It was in the 90s that 1/3 of the 65 synods had bishops who came out of the Missouri Synod. 1/3 were AELC. 1/3 were the Seminex group. I was at Augsburg Fortress Publishing in the Christian education department. A real strong contingency in the Christian education publishing house was Old Missouri Synod training, Christian education, faith formation background. The ELCA headquarters in Chicago, same thing. We don't have that same background, seminary, and total holistic education like we had generations ago. So there was a real gift, a real strengthening of the ELCA from the very beginning, from the Seminex, AELC, Old Missouri Synod background. And it wasn't such a clear divide. I was part of an organization called the Youth and Family Institute of Augsburg College. A lot of the congregations that received our work were Missouri Synod because they really emphasized faith formation and Christian education. Two of our largest conferences we ever did was in Missouri with the Missouri Synod. So it's not a simple, divide between those who were ultra-conservative and those who were more progressive. That was very true. But there were those who carried that spirit into the Missouri Synod forward, too.
One should say that this depth that David is talking about was present in Ray Geist, who recently died. His widow, Gay, asked me if I would come and help figure out what to do with his books. And so just the other day, a couple days ago, I took a bunch to the seminary library. In Ray's library, he has Hebrew, Old Testament, Greek, New Testament, Aramaic, New Testament in English. I'm not sure yet what that meant, but I suppose the Aramaic was somehow a basis of it. Anyway, then there are lexicons. As a lexicon, a German lexicon of the Hebrew Bible. Now, none of us is going to use something like that. Plus, he has a 2-volume biography that Schweitzer wrote about J.S. Bach, and a number of other books like this. And here's the interesting thing. Gay said to me, Ray was destroyed by all of this. He was a Missouri Synod pastor. He felt betrayed by what Missouri Synod had done, and she said he was in great, great pain.
What a sad, sad history for Ray and many, many others. Just one other note about the complexity of all this. So we think of the Missouri Synod and their arch rigidity and so forth. I went to the East Coast to do my youth and family work with a Missouri Synod district, and they had me preach at a Missouri Synod congregation, and then they asked me to preside. And I said, "Are you sure you want that?" And they said, yes. They said, out here on the East Coast, we're far away from St. Louis, we're really more progressive than you ELCA folk. That's what they said. That's what they said.
That was true on the West Coast as well, as I got to know several, when I was at Valparaiso and was immersed in Pan-Lutheranism, and I got to know the Missouri Synod a lot better than having grown up LCA. But a lot of my close friends were from California area, and their sense of the Missouri Synod there was much more like you experienced on the East Coast as well.
Can I say when I went to Elmhurst College, my music prof was absolutely wonderful. He came from the Evangelical Synod, but he called his church a Lutheran church, as did the theology prof. And guess where he told me I could go to learn some of the things I was wanting to learn? Go to the Valparaiso church music seminars, and indeed, that is an amazing school, which brought together a whole bunch of these things.
I can see we're just tapping in the tip of the iceberg on so many things. Are there any, it's about time to close. Is there a question that somebody would like to ask Gary?
I have a question about, then, what does all this mean about, there's a characteristic that's present and always has been about this congregation. So, I've been here a long time, and one of the things that I have always loved and admired about this congregation that I so sorely missed in the previous congregations that I served is that I feel like people that come to church here, they come and they bring their brain in with them. And I had served so many other churches that they leave their brain at the door, and all that's left when they walk in to the worship service is all of their emotions. And they only are present with all their emotions. So emotions means that it's all about their preferences and their likes and their dislikes, and I like to hear that, I don't like to hear that, I like to sing that song, and I don't like to sing that song, and I will not sing that song. But people here, I mean, what was it? There was something, must have been something about the founding families of that congregation in 1947 that fostered that kind of thinking. Or, is it divine guidance, or the first couple of pastors that they had? What was it isn't it fascinating that this congregation worships like that? And not only worships like that, but they bring in the two opposing bulls of the opposing leaders of these two denominations, the Missouri Synod and the whatever all those other letters are, the other and they didn't go anywhere else. They came, oh my gosh, they came here, and the people of this congregation, if they had their mind made up ahead of time or not, their mind was about the compromise and giving fair voice to both sides, and then they made up their mind by using their brains. It wasn't, I don't know, I wasn't there. I assume it wasn't just purely based on their emotions, right? But is anybody else curious? How did that characteristic develop and become so strong here?
I could add just a couple little things here. My parents moved right out after World War II, like so many people did, basement house, all that. They originally went to St. Stephanus and St. Paul. And my parents were not founding members, but they joined right after. And my dad had a shop out there, and the pastor from this church, I think it was even before Jerry Wagner, came out and says, we'd like to invite you to church. And my dad said, well, we go to St. Stephanus every Sunday. He said, well, I'd like you to come to the church. I didn't realize the Missouri Synod being as kind of strict as it was, because we were a little bit different. But he said to my dad, well, he says, come and give our church a try. He says, I'll buy you a case of beer. and another real, I didn't realize it growing up when I was a teenager, we had a Boy Scout troop here. I did not realize until later on, when hearing some of the conversations about the break with the Missouri Synod, that was forbidden. But we had a Boy Scout troop 401, was right here. We met here for years. Nobody even talked about it. So I think this church has always had kind of a get real, live in the practical world, because some of the things that the Missouri Synod back then, they were opposed to dancing. It was kind of like they were opposed to fun, and that just never was this congregation growing up until the controversy started in the early 70s, and by then I was an adult and out of the service, that kind of thing. So that just kind of, maybe, I don't know if that adds
That helps. That really helps. And Gary, your question, I'd like it to be seen as a living question for us, at least for this year and well beyond. What makes the kind of openness, receptivity, focus on worship and music such a living presence? For me, one thing I'm taking away from this is that there are notable moments in life of congregation. And boy, the 1970s, the lay and pastoral leadership here really displayed, I think, some of the best we could hope for congregational life. Wayne, I'm going to have you second last word, and then Pastor Sarah.
I just wanted to.
Okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that this traumatic experience was not without pain, that because there weren't 100% agreement, we ended up over a 2 or 3 year period losing almost half of our congregation.
Okay.
So
That's part of the story we didn't hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, you know,
Ouch.
what's left is what Gary sees,
Yeah.
and the rest have
So there's a
gone.
kind of a filtering that went on for a certain kind of spirit.
Yeah.
And then the anti-penultimate, Bob Hausman.
No, I'd like to pick up on what I think you were trying to say, David, earlier.
Bob, what was I
the-
trying to say?
About the Missouri Synod bringing the family in and starting the children in the faith and having worship, faith at home. But the other thing is we need faith in the church. Everybody needs to be bringing to worship their children, their grandchildren, tell other people about it so that they can grow up in the faith. At the same time, it is more challenging now than ever because we don't live in a Christian situation. We live a secular world right now. And pluralism is a part of the life of all of our family. My kids, they teach Muslim kids. The high schoolers go to school with blacks and Muslims and so forth. And the church needs to be saying, what does it mean for us as Christians to realize that there are other people out there with different gods or no gods, and how do we interact with them? And we better have our heads working to be able to be a part of that conversation.
Thank you, Bob. I really wasn't focusing on the church and the home, but that is a good point. We could focus on that at a later date. Pastor Sarah, why don't you give us the last word and send us out, please?
So one of the things that we know through applying things like family systems theory to congregations is that when a congregation, when an individual goes through a traumatic experience, right, or when a family goes through a traumatic experience, when they use a process that's healthy and positive, they emerge on the other side stronger. So what we find in congregations, like, for example, congregations who decide that they need to merge with another congregation or that they need to die for some reason, those individuals go to another congregation and they become the leaders very quickly. One, because they know about hard work. Two, because they've done some emotional work and that is emotional and intellectual together. That means they've grown up a little bit. That they're entering as adults, and it makes a huge difference in the life of the congregation. And so I think one of the things, looking back on the whole history of this congregation, that we can celebrate is actually those traumas, those hard times, and the way that the congregation moved through it and has come to a point where now we can continue to take on hard things. We're not a rest on your laurels kind of place. We're a continue to take on hard stuff kind of place. And that's, in my opinion, where God is calling us to in the next 75 years of our life together. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. What's your name again? Just kidding. David. Gloria.
Gloria's husband. I didn't call that.
The guy who talks about church at home all the time? No, thank you. Thank you very much for preparing the outline for us. Thank you all for your wisdom that you've shared. Thank you all for your questions and for being here. Blessings on your